Chapter 109, The Storehouse, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu had imagined the god's storage room like a magical cave from a story. He'd pictured glittering veins of jewels and precious metals in the walls, and stalactites and stalagmites like ominous shadowy fangs. He'd envisioned soft dripping sounds and puddles reflecting the eerie light of glowing mushrooms or bugs. He'd half hoped for some kind of monster lurking in the depths. Of course, when he'd thought of all this, he'd been imagining himself seeing it with Antony. He'd thought that he would gasp and clutch the god's hand in the event that anything odd or frightened him, that Antony would grumble but indulge him, that he would feel protected and precious at his master's side. Given that he was seeing the cavern with two near strangers with whom he was decidedly not in love, it seemed only natural that the vault itself was much more prosaic than Hanyu had hoped. The walls were clearly not natural stone, but some kind of smooth concrete. The ceiling was relatively low, but the corridors that connected the stairs with dozens of doors set neatly on either side seemed endless. Most of the doors were ajar, and gods were coming and going among them. It was just like the ship, only larger and not made of wood. Hanyu tried not to be too disappointed, but he felt his heart sink nonetheless. So much for my grand adventure. Hanyu could see his underwhelming surroundings by the light of several torches set into the walls in orderly lines. Lord Festus plucked one from its sconce and handed it to him. "Humans can't see in the dark," he informed Hanyu, who only nodded. "Thank you, my lord." His voice came out as dull as the vault around him. "What did Antony send you for?" Lord Gala asked. "Oh, shit." Hanyu didn't hesitate, instead spouting the first thing that came to mind. Books! Chihiro had been impressed by the supply of books when he told the others about his own island expedition. Surely that would be at least a little interesting. Anyhow, Hanyu couldn't exactly tell the gods that his master had sent him to look at your most impressive and shiny ancient treasures. "This way, then." Lord Gala marched down the hallway, and Hanyu trailed after her. He peered curiously into the various rooms they passed. Just as Antony said, they appeared to contain all kinds of things, most of them deadly boring. Antony saw a god pouring barrels of dried beans into giant sacks. Another was loading a box with lengths of rope. In a room that seemed to be filled with either clothes or fabrics, or perhaps both, he glimpsed a god with broad shoulders and an elaborate hairstyle, and his blood froze. "Cloelia? What if she sees me? What can I say? I'll just stick with my story, but what if Antony said something to Thad or Lord Julia? What if—" The god shifted slightly, and Hanyu relaxed. It wasn't Cloelia after all. Still, the moment of panic convinced him to keep his head down as he walked in case any gods he knew happened to be in the caves. "Here we are," Lord Gala announced after just a few more doors. "Looks like you're the first to get here." Indeed, the door she opened for Hanyu showed only darkness in the room beyond. When he entered with his torch, however, he couldn't restrain the sort of delighted gasp he'd expected to give at the sight of the cave. The room was big, bigger than he'd realized from the hallway. Antony's little cabin could have fit into it 3 times over, and it was stuffed so tightly with boxes of books that there were only thin trails to reach the back piles. There weren't quite as many as there had been in the temple library, but these books seemed bursting with promise and possibility. These were new. "There's sacks and boxes over here," Lord Festus said, drawing Hanyu's gaze away from the enticing piles. "You can use any of them to carry your haul." "Is there anything else you need?" Lord Gala asked, brisk but not unkind. Hanyu ducked his head. "My lords have been far kinder than I deserve. I'll be sure to return the boots." "Don't fret about it," Lord Festus said with an airy wave of his hand that made Hanyu long unexpectedly for Thad. "Antony knows where I live. He can return them any time. We'll see you later." He made his full bow, but he wasn't sure whether they even saw as they left. Hanyu liked his new friends. Still, he wasn't sorry to see them go. It would have been impossible to focus on his adventure, or even to have one, with the gods hanging around. For now, it seemed wise to actually collect some books. They would be a useful prop if any other gods questioned his presence. Anyhow, this was a good chance to choose something new to read. Maybe he could find some animal books, and Antony would go over them with him. Or he could get poetry, and Antony would lie with his head in Hanyu's lap and let him read aloud. And no! He would not choose books to share with Antony. Antony hadn't asked him to read or showed him new animals since a sow moved into the rooms. That wasn't going to change now. He should choose books that he wanted, and never mind Antony. Better yet, he could find books that Antony would hate. Where are the tawdry romance novels? Once Hanyu really looked at the piles of boxes, which were raised off the floor on thin crates, he could see that they were reasonably organized. Less promisingly, many of the books were written in the strange, looping alphabet of the gods or other, even stranger symbols. The Taishan books were sorted into these collections by subject, not language, so he had to look for them specifically. Still, his own mother tongue was the most common language to find arcing down the spines of the books. He couldn't help feeling a little proud that whatever Antony may once have thought of his people's language, it was now the source of most of the gods' reading materials. He found several romances that looked promising, and, to his joy, a copy of his old favorite about the girl and her camel. There were 4 other books by the same author in that pile, and he realized delightedly that it must be a series. He'd had no idea. He stuffed them into the bag with his other prizes. Hanyu wanted to take a look at the room with clothes that he'd seen earlier. As he picked his way towards the door, though, his eyes fell on a big green book with a picture of a snake on the front. A peek at the contents showed that it was written in an alphabet Hanyu didn't know, but it was full of pictures of snakes, beautifully drawn in full-page illustrations. When he slipped it into his bag, he had to fight down a sudden wave of longing to be curled up on the sofa next to Antony, talking and laughing together. Gods, he missed that. I'm not getting this book for that. That or Lord Theo probably knows this language. Even if they don't, the pictures are interesting. I don't really need anyone to read it to me. The god who looked like Cloelia wasn't in the clothes room when Hanyu stepped into it, which was a relief. He was free to settle his torch into a sconce and look around without any self-consciousness or formalities. As he'd hoped, the room was full of ready-made clothes rather than fabric, which must be stored elsewhere. Hanyu was terrible at sewing, always getting distracted and stabbing himself with the needle and bleeding on whatever he was trying to make or embroider. The sewing instructor back at the temple wouldn't even let him use the more expensive materials. No, ready-made clothes were far preferable to anything he would have tried to make himself, and Hanyu began sorting through the crates cheerfully. Most of the clothes were old-fashioned Taishan robes. Hanyu found several that seemed like they would fit him, with beautiful fabrics and gorgeous embroidery. They were pretty enough that he didn't mind the antiquated cuts. There was one deep blue robe covered in silver spangles that made him think of a night sky full of stars, and he loved it so much that it was a struggle not to strip down in the middle of the cavern and change into it immediately. Was this how it felt to go shopping in the stores and markets of the city? Hanyu had never been allowed to do something like that, but he'd read about it in books. It was strangely delightful to choose things for himself, unhurried, examining whatever caught his eye, accepting or rejecting on a whim. There was still a low, stony throbbing in the pits of his stomach, sadness and anger and fear knotted together and making it impossible to relax. But he didn't need to be relaxed. He was on an adventure, having fun, and it was all right if the edges of his excitement felt a little ragged. One robe that caught his eye was a delicate pale pink, like the barest hint of dawn. The fabric was so smooth and shiny it seemed almost slippery, and though the stitching was simple and the robe clearly much too small for him, Hanyu packed it anyway. It seemed like something a sow might wear. A sow. Antony. Why was he so fixated on those two? His head seemed stuffed full of things he knew about them and their preferences. He couldn't even look at books or clothes without being accosted at every turn by things that reminded him of them. How could he know so much about two people and also so little? They filled his mind and occupied all his thoughts, but he didn't know the most important things. How to be what they wanted. How to make them stay. The caverns felt suddenly suffocating. Hanyu grabbed his torch and pushed blindly out of the room. He marched through the concrete corridor, barely remembering to step aside and bow his head before the dozens of bustling, unfamiliar gods. By the time he reached the stairs, it was a struggle not to run. He felt a little better as he stepped into the cold night air of the island, but there was still so much activity pressing in on him. Gods were loading sacks and boxes onto rowboats, chattering and shouting to one another. It would be easy to get a ride back to the ship, but Hanyu recoiled from the thought. He wasn't ready for that. He needed solitude. That was unusual. Hanyu had never been one of the boys who squeezed himself into underused rooms and quiet corners in the hopes of a few minutes alone. He liked to be surrounded by people, but right now his head was so full of other people and his feelings about them that it just seemed like too much to be around others physically as well. His sack wasn't heavy. He could walk with it for quite a while. Hanyu turned away from the bustle of the beach and walked in the opposite direction. He was grateful for his torch, which let him pick his way around the big rocks. He was even more grateful for Lord Festus's heavy boots. With their protection, he was well away from the commotion in a few minutes. The worst thing about his hurt feelings and anger was the knowledge that they weren't fair. He couldn't just rage against his master and friend in peace because he kept thinking how unjust he was being, and that only served to upset him more. Asao was clearly terrified of Antony, no matter what their master did to ease his fears, and Hanyu's informality didn't help the situation. Thad was a lovely, sweet god who anybody would be lucky to belong to. It was understandable that Asao might hope for Thad to claim him. His desire to leave probably didn't have anything to do with Hanyu at all, which, if anything, only made him feel worse. And Antony... Of course Antony had been focused on his beloved brother, not a human slave who was safe and well. Of course he had turned to Marcus for comfort. Felix had gone on and on about how hard it was for wonderful people to stop being in love with horrible people, even if Hanyu didn't understand it. That was the most frustrating thing of all. Marcus was so awful. Why couldn't Antony see that he deserved better? Why didn't he just know that he ought to be with someone who adored him and treated him well and would never, ever hurt him? Why couldn't he love Felix or Cloelia or Thad or... me? I want him to love me. It was so obvious now that Hanyu took a moment to think about it. He wanted Antony to love him back, and he was hurt and angry when his god didn't. Oh no! This was bad. This was the worst possible outcome for Hanyu's feelings towards his master. It was fine for an offering to love his god, expected even. His whole purpose was to be devoted to Antony, but to seek reciprocation? To turn angry and disobedient when he felt rejected? He was acting like he thought he was Antony's equal. Where had this blasphemous presumption even come from? Was it the way Lord Theodora and Thad had behaved towards him? Was it his master's obvious love for his previous human partners? Was it the way he treated Hanyu himself? All the gentleness and listening? It didn't matter where Hanyu had gotten these ideas. What mattered was that he crushed them, immediately and forever. He was a human, a slave. From Lord Antony's perspective, he must be nothing more than a gnat, short-lived and insignificant. Ever since he was an infant, given or sold to the temple, his life had had only one purpose, to be used however his betters chose, and his betters included just about everybody. He owed his master obedience, blood, worship, service, and he was not owed anything in return, and the sooner he remembered that, the better. Asao had been right. Asao was always right. Hanyu had taken advantage of his god's indulgence, and it had led to this: misery, confusion, ridiculous acts of defiance, and ideas above his station. He needed to go back immediately so he could throw himself at his master's feet, confess his disobedience in coming to this stupid island, and take the punishment he so richly deserved. He turned around. He'd left the beach far behind in his wanderings, but if he just went back more or less the way he'd came, he was sure to find it eventually. A soft, strangled noise broke into Hanyu's horror-struck spiraling. He looked up, but whatever had caused the sound was outside the reach of his torchlight. Nobody had said anything about animals on the island. It must have been one of the gods. "Hello?" Hanyu ventured, taking a cautious step towards the sound. He still couldn't see whoever had made the squeak, but he froze in place when he heard a dark, delighted, horribly familiar chuckle. "Hello to you too, little one."